name's Lindsay, and this is Weird. Agnes Woodcock had not anticipated what she would find that day when she made plans to spend the night at the home of Cindy James. She knew her friend had been terrorized by someone, or perhaps several someones, and being alone right now for Cindy was an agonizing prospect. She had called Cindy around 9:00 p.m., but instead of hearing Cindy's warm voice greeting her over the phone, she was left with a dangling sense of fear as the line continued to ring. 5 rings, 10 rings, 20. She hastily drove over to the house, telling herself that the unanswered call could be for any number of reasons. Cindy being in the shower, or perhaps out in the garage. There was no reason to panic. Not yet. She arrived around 9:30 p.m., confident that whatever had taken her friend from the phone had passed. But the repeated sound of the doorbell, followed by insistent knocks, remained as before, unanswered. She went from the front door to the back door. More silence. More silence, but for the quiet groan rising from the yard. Agnes tilted her head to listen. Someone was in the stairwell. She rushed down the steps and saw her friend, slumped and barely conscious. Slash marks covered her limbs, and a black stocking had been cinched around her neck so tight that Agnes's hurried fingers were unable to get under the fabric to loosen it. Agnes ran to the door of the downstairs tenant, pounding relentlessly until her screams for help were finally answered. The tenant, knife in hand, rushed to Cindy, freeing her of the stocking that surely would have ended her life had they not been there. Dazed, gasping for air, soaked in blood, Cindy had survived the first of many attacks. So here's the thing. This case became increasingly personal for me the more research that I put into it. Now, if you follow me on Twitter or on Facebook, then you might have seen the post that I made about it. But if you don't, or if you didn't see the post, then here's the gist of it. Outside of the podcast, I provide support for women who have experienced or are experiencing domestic violence. My interest in domestic violence and stalking prevention and my passion for mental health awareness are both factors in my decision to go back to school to study psychology. Domestic violence and stalking are both, well, they're really misunderstood and to a fatal level. And this is also true with mental health awareness. It really doesn't make people aware enough. It's often portrayed as extreme sadness or extreme nervousness without really honestly showing how destructive and diverse these illnesses can be for those who are suffering from them. The term mental illness or mental health, it's really an umbrella statement, and it literally covers thousands of diagnoses. It's complicated, it's scary, it's overwhelming, and it can be very messy. And society's failure to have open dialogue about these nuances and complexities has also contributed, like that of domestic violence and stalking, to the fatality of those who are suffering. And to be clear, I don't use the term suffering lightly. These things, whether it's domestic violence or stalking or mental health, they can be and often are, well, they're insidious in nature. They permeate everything in your life. They bleed into every corner of consciousness, and they impair functionality and judgment, relationships. Even having a concrete sense of reality, a luxury many of us enjoy, this can dissolve into a vapor of suspicion and foreboding. So whatever conclusions you come to regarding Cindy James, I encourage you to consider the complete terror that she would have been experiencing for years up until her tragic death. And I also urge you to consider these things prior to judging those who have stayed in abusive situations, prior to judging those who behave in a way that is difficult to understand, prior to judging those who are simply trying to desperately navigate life with a basic sense of normalcy. What may seem easy or black and white to you may present incredible challenges to someone else, which is why empathy and capacity building in these areas is, in my mind, essential to providing support for those who are struggling with these things and other issues. And also, to be clear, domestic violence, stalking, and mental health are, of course, not one in the same. But as you will see in this episode, they can meld together, which serves only to rub salt in an already excruciating wound. So my primary resources for this episode include a website put together by Cindy's sister, Melanie, and that's melaniehack.com. She actually wrote a book about Cindy's story, which I've not been able to track down, unfortunately. I did email her for a copy, but I have not heard back. I've also been reading The Deaths of Cindy James by Neil Hall, which is now out of print. I did manage to secure a copy, and in the same boat is Who Killed Cindy James by Ian Mulgrew. There's a few other podcasts and YouTube videos which have covered her story as well. The ones that I used as sources have been listed in the show notes. However, I do want to draw attention to a specific podcast. I had actually never heard of this case before until I listened to a podcast called The Dark Divide. And The Dark Divide, it combines this masterful storytelling with chilling tales of the macabre and the tragic. The writing truly is, it's poetic, it's captivating, it tiptoes through the mire of darkness and explores the corners dusted with cobwebs and closets musty with skeletons. The host deftly guides the listener through the narrative using really a profound understanding of composition, experiences, emotions, empathy, pain. You can find info about The Dark Divide under recommendations on my website, theweirdpod.com. So if you are looking for another podcast to listen to, I would highly recommend The Dark Divide. So Cindy, her brutal death remains unsolved to this day, and it led to the most expensive coroner's court inquiry in British Columbia's history. So let's back things up a little bit. How did a beloved and talented nurse meet her end in such a grisly way? And unfortunately, we really just don't have many answers. Cindy James was born Cynthia Elizabeth Hack, June 12th, 1944 in British Columbia, Canada. She was the second oldest of 6 children and was known to be quiet, polite, and kind. Cindy's mother, Tilly, was a full-time stay-at-home mom, and her father joined the RCAF when Cindy was 5 years old. Although they moved around a lot, Cindy maintained excellent grades, though she was known for being shy, which makes sense given that she didn't have much opportunity to form deep connections. Her family was devoutly religious, regularly attending the Lutheran church on Sundays and often reading the Bible after dinner. Her father was quite strict, and later in life, Cindy had been quoted as saying, "I was afraid of my father, and no matter how I tried, it seemed I never succeeded in winning praise or approval. I grew up often feeling my parents would separate. My father was very difficult to communicate with and ruled the household in the same way he ruled his subordinates in the Air Force." Her mother, on the other hand, was described as being nurturing and warm. Now, these recollections do not coincide with other accounts of the family. Both Otto and Tilly described their parenting style as firm but fair. According to the Neil Hall book, as well as her sister Marlene, they recalled a happy and normal childhood. Although she did feel that sometimes Otto's parenting style fell more in line with this idea that children should be seen and not heard. So already the picture that's being painted is a complex one, which makes sense. Every family has their foibles, and it's tough to say just how extreme on either end of the pendulum these foibles extend. An important characteristic of Cindy's, which Marlene noted, was that Cindy often wouldn't stand up for herself, and she would keep her discontent about various things a secret. She was unwilling to disclose things that made her upset, and she would internalize much of her angst. She always had this kind of secrecy, this quality of privacy about her, which is something that comes up throughout the case. In 1965, Cindy met Dr. Roy Makepeace, the man who she would later marry. Roy grew up in South Africa during the Great Depression and moved to Canada in 1954. He was a decorated veteran of the Air Force, having served during the Second World War. He was well educated and intelligent. He held a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology and Zoology, an honors postgraduate degree with distinction in psychology, and a certificate in industrial psychology. He studied medicine, neurology, and surgery, and eventually completed a 4-year psychiatric residency at Vancouver General Hospital, which is where he crossed paths with Cindy. The romance between Cindy and Roy was fraught with scandal. Roy was married at the time with children, and thanks to a private detective with a zoom lens, it didn't take long for Roy's marriage to dissolve into divorce. 4 days after the divorce was finalized, Cindy and Roy were married. They were happy those first few years, and those close to the couple felt that it was actually a really good match, and their lives were filled with much love and laughter. Cindy's career as a nurse flourished, and she specialized in child psychiatry, eventually finding work as the director of Blenheim House, working with children with various psychiatric challenges. As Roy and Cindy's career progressed, so did their affluence, and Roy took sailing on as a hobby. However, Cindy was not a fan of being out on the water. In 1977, Roy purchased a boat, which he dubbed the Peacemaker, a name which, in my opinion, it says a lot about Roy's personality, but I won't go there at the moment. Cindy did join Roy on his sailing adventures, though she wasn't particularly fond of it, and she really preferred to just nurture her garden that she tended at home. By 1981, the marriage had hit stormy seas, with the couple arguing about suspected infidelity. At one point, Roy became so agitated that he slapped Cindy across the face. Later, Roy would write in a letter written by him to investigators, in which he stated, "I have always deplored such violence which degrades both parties involved, even though it is provoked by persistent and vehement verbal abuse." In a later and more rational discussion, Cindy held the view that verbal abuse is fair game and that there is never any justification for physical violence, no matter what the provocation might be. I can only reply that the world at large disagrees. It takes two to tango, and both parties are equally responsible to discontinue any trends that commonly lead to violence. So, where do I even begin with this bullshit? First of all, intimate partner violence, it's never okay. It is never okay. Secondly, you are not responsible for your partner's actions, and your partner is not responsible for yours. Verbal abuse, not okay. Does that justify physically attacking your partner? Nope. Not ever. Not once. A 2015 article written by Dr. Silke Meyer in the peer-reviewed journal Theoretical Criminology states, narratives reveal experiences of victim-blaming attitudes when seeking help from informal and general formal support sources, which suggest that victims of IPV do not meet the criteria of the ideal innocent victim worthy of ongoing formal and informal support. Drawing on criminological theories of redemption and assistance in combination with victimological theories around social stigma and construction of the ideal victim, the study finds that victims often feel they have to redeem themselves as worthy of empathy in order to access ongoing support. These misplaced expectations of desistance with the victim rather than the perpetrator highlight that the social stigma associated with IPV goes beyond the private nature of this type of violence and extends to victim behavior and decision making. This concept of Cindy not being an ideal victim, it comes up again and again and again for her as she seeks formal support. It's a common theme throughout the investigation, which we'll go into with more depth. And to be honest, it's a common theme for many of the individuals that I work with who have experienced or are experiencing IPV. It's not at all a rare occurrence to be disregarded by formal and informal supports because you don't match their ideal of what a victim should look like. It's no wonder that so many people hesitate to report abuse, and this extends to Cindy also. Roy and Cindy had been married for 16 years prior to the commencement of their trial separation, July 1st, 1982. On October 7th, 1982, a single phone call would mark the beginning of 7 long years of insidious psychological and physical torment for Cindy, culminating in her tragic death. The phone rang, And much to Cindy's horror, it was an anonymous person on the line repeating her name over and over and describing in detail how he was going to sexually mutilate her. She hung up, but the calls kept coming. Sometimes they involved heavy breathing. Other times the unknown perpetrator would utter ominous threats such as, "You're dead, Cindy." And by October 12th, Cindy had reported the harassment to the police. It didn't take long for the calls to escalate. On October 15th, Cindy's back window was smashed and the back door was found unlocked, though nothing had been taken. Several days later, Cindy returned home with her friend, Agnes Woodcock, only to find that the back door, yet again, stood open. The key to the house was found on the bedroom floor, and her pillows had been slashed and shredded. They left the house and called 911 from a neighbor's. Constable Pat McBride took the call, advising Cindy to change her locks, install deadbolts, and promise to have the area patrolled more frequently. In fact, Pat McBride himself installed the locks for Cindy, and the two soon became close. Pat decided to sublet a room in Cindy's house where they shared the mundane expenses of the house, ate meals together, and spent weekends going out. I would guess that being in a relationship with the woman who is central to your investigation is probably a conflict of interest, but you do you. No judgment. Even with Pat's presence, however, the harassment continued. Phone calls, threatening notes. She changed her phone number and had it unlisted, which really did fuck all to help her out. Now, Pat McBride did casually question Roy about any possible involvement in Cindy's harassment, but nothing stood out to Pat that would warrant further suspicion. Now, I'm going to stop here. I'm not saying it was Roy. I really don't know who it was, honest. But something folks need to start understanding about stalkers is that they are perfectly capable of being charming and wonderful and lovely when it suits them. There's probably aspects of their personalities that really are those things. I actually loved the portrayal of Joe in You. It's a book by Carolyn Kepnes, which was recently adapted into a fabulous Netflix series. Joe, he's got a lot of wonderful attributes. He's thoughtful and kind. He's nurturing in some respects. But he's also insidious. He's blind to his own deviancy. He justifies it through a distorted lens of love and delusion. He's a great example of why people often don't believe victims of stalking. Truly, if I had a dime for every time I heard the line, "They don't seem like the type to do that kind of thing," I'd probably be a fairly rich woman right now. So again, I'm not saying that Roy is guilty. I'm just saying that these first impressions, they aren't always accurate or reliable. Now, speaking of Roy, Pat McBride found Roy sitting in his car in Cindy's back alley, engine and lights turned off, watching her house. Found in the car with him was a rifle and a handgun. Roy indicated that he was hoping to catch Cindy's assailant. Cindy had also complained to McBride about Roy waking her up one night by knocking on her window to tell her that he was standing guard, again carrying a rifle and a hunting knife. Following the incident with Pat, Roy contacted Cindy warning her not to use her downstairs laundry. This is a quote from Cindy that's in the Neil Hall book, and she said, "He warned me that I better stop using the downstairs laundry room as someone could easily slip in there when my back was turned, slit my throat, and I might not be found for days. He was getting worked up again, so I told him to stop talking like that. It didn't help, and it was just scary. He got really angry and said I wouldn't laugh when it happened. He warned me it was a jungle out there and I wouldn't survive on my own. He offered me another chance to move back with him. When I refused, he stormed off, making all kinds of dire predictions of what would happen." Cindy's neighbor did witness a man she didn't recognize hanging around Cindy's house several times, leaving the house from the front door, knocking on doors. And she knew what Roy and Pat both looked like, and it definitely wasn't the landlord, so they were immediately eliminated as the mystery man. On another occasion, a different neighbor who lived behind Cindy's house witnessed somebody running from Cindy's backyard after breaking her back gate. Moving along through the winter, and Cindy's phone lines are found to be cut. Notably, a pair of wire cutters were found on top of Pat's toolbox in his bedroom, which he couldn't recall leaving out. So there's some debate about the meaning of the wire cutters. The black residue found on them indicated that they'd been used to cut something, possibly the phone lines. But Pat reasoned that they were too small for the task, and he also felt it was possible he left the wire cutters out and just forgot that he did. Either way, this is where the idea of Cindy possibly orchestrating the incidents herself is introduced. However, and this is a huge flaw in that theory. First, you have the neighbors witnessing multiple prowlers around Cindy's home. You could maybe brush that off as ruffians or troublemakers, etc. But the detail that I can't get over is that Pat McBride was actually with Cindy when she received a lot of these phone calls. She's not the pokeroo, and as the case gets more bizarre and Cindy becomes more withdrawn and secretive, no explanation is ever offered as to how she could manage to place those calls well in the presence of Pat McBride. Ever the shining knight, Roy offered that Cindy move back into the larger house that they shared together. He also promised to take up residence in an apartment. Cindy accepted this time, and the locks were promptly changed, though Roy still had access to the garage and basement so he could continue tinkering with his boat. Before Cindy could move, however, another attack ensued. Cindy's friend Agnes was going to be spending the night at Cindy's, but when she called ahead, there was no answer. She arrived at Cindy's place around 9:30 p.m., but she didn't come to the door, despite persistent knocking. Eventually, Agnes discovered Cindy in the basement stairwell. There were slash marks on her limbs, a black stocking was tied around her neck, and it was tied so tightly that Agnes was unable to get her fingers underneath the stocking to work it loose. A neighbor with a knife arrived on the scene and cut off the stocking. Her blouse had been ripped, her leg cut and bloody. Cindy would later state that she had been grabbed from behind while moving boxes, but that she could not recall or didn't see the identity of her assailant. First responders on the scene noted that Cindy was coherent and not under the influence of any drugs or alcohol as they spoke to her. Bloodstains and spatter marks were discovered in the garage and the bathroom, although there were no signs of a struggle in the garage itself. In terms of Cindy's health, she had bruises to her head and a strangulation mark around her neck. All told, she suffered around 14 cuts, the longest of which was on her leg at 10 centimeters. They were mostly superficial, but amid the struggle, Cindy said she felt a pinprick on her left shoulder. Though she initially had stated that it was on her right, upon examination, there was what looked to be a syringe mark on the inside of her right arm. She gave a brief account of the incident to police the following day. During the attack, her assailants made threatening remarks toward her family, which influenced her decision not to reveal too much to the police, and it would be years before she gave a more detailed version of events. Cindy had heard a knock on the door, and at first appearance, she thought it was actually Pat McBride, standing with his back to the window. However, as she opened the door to let him in, she realized to her horror it wasn't him at all, as he turned around pulling a ski mask down over his face. He was able to get through the door, chasing Cindy down to the bathroom where there was a struggle. He had a knife in his hand and appeared to threaten to stab her dog, Heidi, which, if someone did that to my dogs, I'd go full John Wick on their asses. Let's be completely honest here. He managed to grab Cindy by her arm and hair, forcing her into the kitchen and out the back door. From there, he threw her into the garage where another man was waiting. She was pinned to the ground, and as her second attacker cut her body, he hissed, "See this knife? It would be so easy to slice your throat, but that would be too quick. You were warned to get rid of the fucking pigs, and you didn't. You're going to die real slow, cunt." Before tightening the stocking around her neck, he said, "You're dead, bitch. Maybe we'll have some fun with your mother and two sisters next. The blonde, sexy one, she looks like she'd be good." The men left Cindy to die, which was when she managed to stumble outside before passing out, thankfully to be found by Agnes. I do find it odd that Roy had this habit of terrifying Cindy with these awful predictions, followed by an invitation to have her stay with him. And once these predictions came to pass, she, of course, would take him up on his offer. According to the Neil Hall book, police observed that Roy's place, even after they had separated, was decorated with several photos of Cindy. I've seen descriptions that it was an actual kind of shrine to Cindy. Again, I'm not saying that it was him. There's just some oddness there that I find, well, odd. Cindy willingly submitted to a lie detector test, which she failed, but I'm going to talk about that in a second. Authorities also requested that Roy take a polygraph as well, which he agreed to, but ultimately he wasn't able to take it due to some heart medication that he was taking, which could have an effect on the test results. So the thing with polygraphs is that they're pretty much bullshit. The term lie detector is inherently misleading. They don't detect lies. They detect stress and anxiety, things that people experience sometimes when consciously lying, but also makes them subject to serious scrutiny. They're inadmissible in court, and there's a million reasons why a person could fail or pass one. Cindy, who openly and willingly took the polygraph, failed. Does that mean she was being untruthful? Maybe. But it could also mean that she was experiencing extreme anxiety and trauma, which would be entirely normal given what she's been through. I found a thread on Quora where a former healthcare security officer was answering some questions about a polygraph test, and he said something that I hadn't considered before, which is, one basic principle of deception detection is convey versus convince. Someone who's lying feels a need to be believed, will be worried that his lie isn't working, and will work to convince you of his story. Someone telling the truth will feel their story's veracity speaks for itself and will simply convey it to you, assuming that you'll believe it. He goes on to address the question of what could lead to failing even if a person is telling the truth. When they asked for information about the case, you got agitated or anxious or excited, thinking of how badly you wanted them to believe you, and you looked like you were trying to convince when you were only conveying. So there's that. iScienceMagazine.co.uk did a really interesting write-up about them, and they gave a fantastic example of individuals who were able to consciously beat the polygraph. The article states, time and time again, polygraphs have shown themselves to be undeserving of the name lie detector. Take the case of Ana Montes, a Cuban spy who successfully worked at the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency for over 25 years, despite their regular polygraph tests. Or Floyd Fay, who was sentenced to life in prison following a failed lie detector test, and only released when new DNA evidence came to light. Floyd Fay spent his time in prison reading up about polygraph tests and coaching his fellow inmates to beat the test. With just 15 minutes of training, 23 out of 27 prisoners could beat it. Of course, this is more recent information based on research and experiences that hadn't yet happened. However, the issue of failed or passed polygraphs, it does come up quite a bit throughout Cindy's case, and as well as at the inquest into her death. So I really wanted to address it now as garbage science so that I don't have to keep going back to it because I don't like repeating myself. Okay, moving on. So as I mentioned, Cindy agreed to move back into the house she had shared with Roy. Things seemed to calm down a bit once she was there, but it didn't take long for the harassment to start up again. By February, she was yet again finding threatening letters, phone calls, lights smashed, etc. She moved once again to a small bungalow. She got an unlisted phone number, and she took off to Indonesia to visit her brother. She returned after 2 weeks without incident, but by August, it all started all over again. I can only imagine how exhausting this must have been for her. This time, a note had been sent to her work. Magazine letters were cut out and glued together to spell her name, and inside the note it read, "Welcome back, death, blood, love, hate." The letters became a regular occurrence at work, and rolling into October, Cindy was horrified to discover in her yard a dead cat, a rope tied around its neck. The note next to the corpse said plainly, "You're next." Soon after, she found her beloved garden destroyed and yet another cat corpse at her back door. A terrified and frustrated Cindy decided to hire additional resources to figure out what was happening and to put a stop to it. Ozzy Caban, a security expert and investigator, was hired. His security company is still around today, and they do everything. I mean, everything. Covert operations, cheating spouses, bodyguards, forensic accounting, corporate espionage, security systems, PI services. The list goes on. Caban had been an RCMP officer prior to starting his own security agency, and he's done security detail for Jane Fonda and Queen Elizabeth. He worked with Cindy and her budget to ensure her safety and hopefully catch the culprit. Unfortunately, though, the attacks persisted throughout the winter. Scary calls, cut phone lines, ominous notes, dead cats. And on January 30th, 1984, Cindy was assaulted for the second time. Ozzy arrived at Cindy's home at 6:05 p.m. His team had notified him of suspicious noises coming from the house, and he didn't waste any time hustling over. Through a small gap in the curtained windows, Ozzy could see that someone was laying on the floor. That someone had blonde hair, just like Cindy's. He notified the police and then forced his way inside. Cindy was laying face down in the hallway, and a note had been impaled onto her hand using a knife. Her hand resembling a head on a spike, something you'd hear about in the old stories of Vlad the Impaler. The note read, "Now you must die, cunt." Again, a black nylon stocking had been tied around her neck. Cindy couldn't recall much of the attack, only that a man came upon her as she was going through the back door of her house, hitting her over the head. She recalled some vague details of her assailant: brown eyes, mustached, a blue jacket. Ozzy suspected that Cindy wasn't telling him everything, a personality trait, as we discussed, that Cindy had maintained her entire life. And this kind of contributed to this whole notion that Cindy isn't the quote-unquote ideal victim. It was after this attack that authorities began to seriously focus on Roy Makepeace. Cindy had asserted that there had been several instances of intimate partner violence, some of which Roy admitted to, some of which he denied. He wrote Cindy a letter which was essentially a 4-page long diatribe of "I told you so," reminding her that he predicted her assailant would find her again, stating his shock that she would accuse him of violence in their marriage, and then reiterating how much he cares about her. March 14th, Cindy's parents went to the police station to chat about their concerns regarding Roy. He had asked Cindy's sister, Melanie, to go to the symphony with him. Now, I don't understand the nature of their relationship. I don't know the nature of their relationship, and I'm certainly not going to judge the nature of their relationship. Maybe they were super tight. Regardless, I feel like that's an incredibly weird thing to do when you're literally the only suspect in your ex-wife's terror campaign. Now, it's an easy statement for me to make considering I don't know the nuances of their friendship. Maybe this was a normal thing that they'd done together before. I really don't know. But I would have thought that a psychiatrist of all people would see how, at the very least, that might give the impression of weirdness, of something nefarious going on. In any case, Otto decided to meet up with Roy for coffee to chat about their misgivings. And it was at this meeting that Roy first pitched the idea that Cindy's tormentor was actually the mafia. When I first read that, I thought, is this an M. Night Shyamalan movie with the plot twist being in the wrong part of the movie? The mafia? What? I mean, random, but also, what? Roy had seen a news report featuring Cecil Kirby, and if you aren't familiar with Cecil Kirby, here's a super quick rundown. Cecil had been a mob enforcer and bomber, as well as a member of Satan's Choice, a motorcycle gang which operated mostly in Ontario, Canada. They were heavily involved in drug and sex trafficking, robbery, and the like, and for a time they were rivals with the Hells Angels, but eventually the two clubs merged on December 29th, 2000. So Cecil, as I mentioned, was in Satan's Choice, and he had handed over damaging information to the police, which was directly responsible for the incarceration of 13 people, totaling in enough jail time to last nearly a century. He's been dubbed the most effective criminal turned witness ever to testify against organized crime in Canadian history. So Roy watches this news report and suddenly thinks that maybe all of Cindy's problems could be because of the mafia. Kirby had stated that he would charge $1,000 to beat someone up and $10,000 to kill someone. Roy's theory was that an angry mother of one of the children in Cindy's care wanted revenge for whatever, thereby taking out a contract to have her tormented. Now, Cindy had been involved in a family court situation, which I don't know the details of, but that can definitely happen when working in that sector. It's not strange or unheard of whatsoever. But it resulted in the child being removed from the home. So as it turns out, Cindy did have enemies. Still, though, the mafia... Although AutoHack essentially ended contact with Roy wrote Cindy a few days later saying, "Hi, chickie." Ew. "Last night I heard Zamfir and the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra in the Orpheum. It was magnificent. Unfortunately, I had an empty seat next to me and there were first-class seats, $26.50 apiece, as you can see from your unused ticket. I thought of you every minute and I cried back home. It's lonely without my soulmate at that type of very special performance. I greatly miss our weekly visits." Quick interruption. I just want to be clear, I'm not mocking the fact that he's crying. I think men should be able to express emotions however is appropriate. But I'm more concerned about the fact that he is concerned that he doesn't get to spend time with her like he used to, as opposed to what's actually going on with her. And that's really where that comes from. Okay, back to the letter. "I guess you were under orders to keep bluffing me that there had been no contact from the mafia in the latter half of 1983. Not very smart, though, because I could have blundered right into something vicious, totally unsuspecting, when going to the garage in your absence, as I have done at times. This is one of 3 things the mafia does not tolerate, and they plan to take revenge. Equivalent misery is the name of the game. Remember how the big burly guy was taken out in The Godfather? Back of the hand pinned to the counter, for starters. Drug injections to induce addiction and ensuing psychosocial dysfunction and vulnerability. Dead animals or limb of a loved one tucked in your bed. Next time, maybe? Remember the shock of discovering the slit-up pillowcase? These are all typical mafia terror tactics." The letter scared Cindy, which of course it fucking did, and she handed it over to the police, who advised her to get a restraining order. But also, it's such a weird mix of small talk, love talk, and fear talk. Why would a psychiatrist try to induce anxiety and paranoia in such a way, in someone who's so vulnerable? All of his letters seem to have the same pattern. I care about you, you're in danger, you need to be smarter. If you'd only come back to me, you'd be safe. Roy wrote her another letter on March 23rd and yet another one on March 26th. Admittedly, the March 26th letter is interesting, though weirdly convenient, maybe? I don't know. I know I'm totally biasing all of you against Roy, and I apologize for that. I'll try to stay objective. Essentially, Roy had received a call from a social worker regarding a man named Trevor, last name unknown. Trevor, as it turns out, he liked blondes and gardening, but he had a sadistic streak in him. Behavioral patterns included destroying gardens, slashing clothes, strangulation, threatening the lives of women he was involved with, stalking, harassment, all the things, essentially, that Cindy was dealing with. Though, to be fair, these are common behaviors for a lot of stalkers, so this Trevor fellow, he's really not that remarkable. Upon receiving the information, the police attempted to interview Roy about this mysterious Trevor, but because he refused to talk to them without a lawyer, the probe into the Trevor theory remained unexplored. One other thought about Roy as well. Roy suggested the mafia, then he suggested Mystery Trevor, and it would be Roy later who would suggest that Cindy was suffering from dissociative identity disorder, known as multiple personality disorder at the time, and that she was doing all of these things to herself. Now, it could be that he was genuinely grasping at straws to figure out what was happening with Cindy, or it could be that he was genuinely grasping at straws to divert attention away from him, whether he was responsible for the attacks or not. Days later, Cindy took another polygraph and was judged to be truthful, But we've already covered the fact that polygraphs mean jack shit, so let's move on. That said, Cindy's accusations against Roy Makepeace would be central to everything moving forward. More accurately, Cindy's credibility in regards to her accusations would be central to everything moving forward. Police found her to be secretive and inconsistent. Cindy found the police to be accusatory and unhelpful, and thus, in her own words, learned not to talk to anyone about it. By summer of 1984, the harassment was happening in spades. Vandalism, terrifying phone calls, cut phone lines, threatening notes. Sometimes these things would happen at work as well, not just her home. And the agony of living in such abundant fear on a daily basis began to viciously impair her functionality. She was high-strung at work, sometimes unable to complete tasks or confront colleagues or patients as needed. Occasionally, she would spend the night at work, staking out the mailbox to see if she could catch who was leaving the notes. Her weight was dropping, and there seemed to be no end in sight. She suffered yet another attack on July 23, 1984, while walking her dog in the park around 8:30 p.m. The fact that she was walking her dog alone while it was starting to get dark would cast doubt on her narrative for investigators. They questioned why she would feel safe enough to do that if she wasn't orchestrating these events herself. But here's the thing. I had a stalker many years ago, and as much as it fucks with your sense of safety and faith in what's around you, it can also bring out your stubbornness. I went through periods where I was nervous to go outside, but I also went through periods where I thought, fuck you, I'm not going to let you control me like this. And I'd go out and I'd do whatever the fuck I wanted. Sometimes doing those regular, normal things helps the victim to grasp that sense of normalcy again. I personally don't see Cindy's behavior in this regard to be strange. I see it as a natural byproduct of what was happening to her. And there was another instance where she was walking her dog Heidi. I think it was at 3 a.m. or like some very odd hour. But again, this is a woman that works night shifts. She's not sleeping anyway. She's dealing with high anxiety. She's trying to maintain any sense of normalcy. So I personally don't find that weird. So that evening, she had told Caban that she was going to walk her dog. She had developed a pattern of letting him know her movements so he could keep tabs on her location. While walking the dog, a dark green van pulled up beside her, the driver asking Cindy for directions. There was a man with a beard in the driver's seat and a blonde woman in the passenger seat. After that, Cindy had no recollection of what happened other than possibly hearing Roy's voice saying something in Swahili. Later that evening, a man named Regan Trethaway heard moaning outside of his door, which he had only secured using one of those chain locks, not the deadbolt. He went to investigate and he found Cindy. Her face was blue. She was attempting to squeeze through the small gap between the door and its frame. Again, the stocking around her neck, it was so tight, it was almost impossible to get off. Similar to the other instances, there were 2 puncture marks in her right arm, though tests would reveal that nothing had actually been administered to her. The detectives working the case found at the scene of the attack drag marks, a shoe belonging to Cindy, and her canister of dog repellent that she always carried with her for safety. Investigators checked with Cindy's work to see if they had experienced anything strange, and the receptionist there said that a man who sounded just like Roy had called asking about the security precautions taken at the hospital. Roy, of course, denied making the call. At this point, Cindy's house was under constant surveillance, but no amount of precautions seemed to make any difference in her attacker's objectives. This added to the suspicion that police had regarding Cindy possibly orchestrating the attacks herself. To me, this says that her attacker is just observant and maybe a little bit clever, and who knows, maybe even on the police force. Now, here's the next M. Night Shyamalan moment. October 2nd, 1984. Cindy, under hypnosis, alleged that she witnessed a double murder. She gave no details, only that she had seen it. The stalking continued through the winter and into 1985 when she went under hypnosis yet again. This time, she said that the murders happened in 1981 while she was on a boating trip with Roy. Cindy recalled seeing Roy kill and dismember 2 people. Melanie, Cindy's sister, had been on that trip, though she hadn't reported anything. Of course, the boat was searched for evidence and none was found. Roy was questioned and he denied everything. Between the murder accusations that went nowhere and the constant harassment, Cindy became despondent and she began talking about suicide. She overdosed on sleeping pills, June of 1985, and was hospitalized under the name Cindy James. She was discharged a few days later, after which the harassment continued and continued and continued. Small fires, rotting meat, phone calls. The police amped up their scrupulous surveillance, and after nearly a month without incident, they believed more than ever that Cindy was her own culprit. Cindy, on the other hand, was unhappy with the absence of progress made by law enforcement, thereby deciding to put her house on the market and move yet again. She moved on December 1st, and by December 11th, her tormentor had returned. Cindy was discovered stumbling around in a ditch, and by the time help arrived, she was laying in a pool of water, freezing. Her left foot was bare, and on her right foot was a man's leather boot. There was a rubber glove on her right hand. The glove's mate was later recovered in the same ditch. The nylon, as always, was wrapped securely around her neck. There was an 8-centimeter cut above her left eye, scratches, which looked to be made by fingernails above her left breast, and her limbs and face were badly bruised. She was missing her bra and underwear, and a puncture mark sat oozing on her right arm. Cindy had no memory of her attack, a symptom which confused neurologists. Memory loss can happen when the brain is deprived of oxygen, but not to the degree, in their opinion, that Cindy was experiencing it. They theorized that her extreme lapse in memory, it could be due to what's called retrograde amnesia, which occurs under unbearable psychological trauma. This period in Cindy's life ushered in a rotating door of psychiatrists, analysts, neurologists, doctors, interrogators, and more. Everyone seemed to have a differing opinion. Some believed she was responsible for everything. Others believed that wasn't remotely possible. All believed that regardless of the truth, Cindy was suffering. It's also interesting to note that in 1985, Roy Makepeace also began to experience some disturbing phone calls. Not to the degree that Cindy was receiving them, but they were perplexing enough that not only did he screen his calls and rarely pick up the phone, he invested in equipment that would allow him to record his calls. And that will come up later. In April of 1986, Agnes Woodcock and her husband Tom were with Cindy at her home with the intention of spending the night. They were sitting at the table together, all three of them, playing cards. It was about 3 a.m. and the burglar alarm went off. Cindy, according to Agnes and Tom, had never left the table, much less the room, yet the window in the basement had been removed. This led to the Woodcocks often spending the night at Cindy's place, which meant that Cindy was with them often when this harassment would occur. So like I mentioned before, she's not the pokeroo, which if you're not Canadian, you may not know what the pokeroo is, but that's okay. I'll let you Google it. However, investigators would find contradicting evidence. For example, smashed windows had glass falling outward as though they were being smashed from the inside rather than the outside. Often there were no signs of forced entry, which led law enforcement to believe that the various fires and whatnot were started from someone within the home. At one point, investigators theorized that Cindy was working in tandem with Aussie Command to orchestrate the whole fucking thing. I can't imagine what kind of motivation Aussie would have to do that. He's a well-renowned, world-renowned, and experienced investigator and security specialist. If anything, it would damage his reputation to be unable to figure out who was behind this or to protect Cindy from such insidiousness. Despondent, emaciated, chain-smoking, and feeling utterly hopeless, Cindy's suicidal ideations began to take root. She felt it was her right to end her life if she so chose, which I can see how that might feel like an appealing alternative in her situation. Hear me out. Not only because of the sense of fear and mistrust she's experiencing, but also as a way to claw back control in her life. I have to wonder if her contemplation of suicide gave her a sense of being back in control of her life and her death, as it were, making it her decision when it happened and how, on her terms, depriving her assailant of his twisted game forever. On May 3rd, Cindy was hospitalized again. She was suicidal, terrified, starving. She refused food and water. She refused to talk and even tried to escape once. She would wake up screaming in the night with nightmares, impeding her ability to sleep. Years of torture, abuse, and paranoia had finally needled their way into Cindy's psyche. Eventually, she did begin to take more food and to speak a little bit more. Psychiatrists were divided regarding her diagnosis, and after 3 months of hospitalization, she was discharged. During this time, she'd been on sick leave from work. Upon returning to Blenheim House, she was notified that she would be expected to resign. She was given a year to do so and was also told that she could remain on sick benefits during that year. This was really hard for Cindy. She loved her job. That was something that was very grounding for her. So this sort of added to the stress and the anxiety and the everything that she was going through. Having left Blenheim House, she returned to nursing, and she actually enjoyed a period of about 14 months without incident. However, on June 28th, 1987, her world would fall apart yet again. While Cindy was at work, the burglar alarm in her home alerted the authorities, who, by the way, dismissed it as being caused by the wind. Cindy obviously felt differently. By this point, she had changed her name, her job, her car, her home, her phone number, everything. She had altered everything in her life to evade her mystery predator. 2 months after the alleged wind-triggered alarm, it went off again. This time, a window had been smashed. Only days later, the alarm rang yet again, and yet again, a window was found to be pried open. The harassment seemed to cool off after this sort of brief surge, with only a smashed window in February of 1988, followed by another period of relative peace. She had continued to see a psychiatrist named Dr. Friesen, and together they decided she could start reducing the sleeping pills and tranquilizers that she had come to rely on for her survival. It was also around this time that she started journaling. One of her entries dates April 24th, 1988, and it reads, "Not a bad night. Busy, but not hectic. Had a hard time winding down to go sleep and then awakened by the kids next door around noon. Lay down on the couch with Heidi, curled up by me just to rest, started to cry again. Don't really know why. It's not that I'm aware of feeling lonely, really. I sure wouldn't trade my home life now with what I had with Roy, especially that last year. At least I now have the freedom to do what I want, and I don't have to worry all the time about whether he is in an angry or calm mood. That last year was like living in a nightmare all the time. Always tense, always afraid of saying the wrong thing, trying to anticipate when to disappear for a while and not always successful. No one will ever really understand what it was like. Don't think about it. You left when you knew it was better to be dead than to live like that." On May 15th, she wrote, "While working in the garden, I kept remembering the time Roy, in a fit of anger, stomped all over the bed of seedlings, killing them all. I remember telling him those were living things he had so wantonly destroyed. It hurt so much, and it was so frightening." Most of her journal entries involved talking about her exhaustion, her anger toward Roy, her anger toward her parents, her desire for normalcy. A wish, sadly, that would never come to fruition. October 26th, 1988, an unmarked police car driven by Constable Sandro Colasico arrived at the home of Cindy James, having been dispatched after receiving an alarm from Aussie Command's company. The constable discovered Cindy near lifeless, her feet dangling out of the driver's side door of her car. She was naked from the waist down, hands tied behind her back, with her panic button held tightly in her right hand. Tape covered her nostrils. The constable noted that she felt cold to the touch, and he couldn't detect a pulse. He called in the incident and was soon joined by Constable Colin Adair and Constable Sam Salters. Adair double-checked her pulse, and in doing so heard the faintest of breaths coming from Cindy's body. As you likely have guessed, there was indeed a nylon tied around her neck, which again had to be cut off. They also untied her wrists in the process, and it would take Constable Salters giving her mouth to mouth before Cindy's breathing became consistent. Police dogs were unable to detect the scent of anything unusual in the area. Moreover, no fingerprints were found, not even Cindy's. Authorities consulted with a knot expert named Robert Chisnall, November 1st, 1988. Robert, other than being an experienced climber, had over 2 decades of experience with knots. P.S. I had no idea that knots had its own specialization. I'm a little intrigued. He was also one of the founding members of the International Guild of Knot Tiers, having originated over 100 knots of his own. Some of these knots are used by professional climbers and surgeons, and this wasn't the first time he's consulted on legal matters, having done so for the Toronto Police, the Ontario Provincial Police, and the RCMP. In short, dude knows his knots. Chisnall determined that it was highly unlikely that Cindy could have done this to herself. The knots had no slip loops that would enable her to do so, although he asserted that the stalking tied around Cindy's neck was not actually tight enough this time to cause her death. I'm curious about what he would have said about the other instances of strangulation, and I'm also curious if the stalking wasn't tight enough to actually cause her death, and how was her pulse so non-existent? But anyway, Cindy enjoyed, as much as a person experienced such trauma could, I suppose, 3 months of quiet. In January of 1989, however, a tragic event occurred in Cindy's home. Though most certainly unrelated to the previous events, this is no less devastating for Cindy. A good friend of hers, Ton Gronvelt, was found dead and slumped over the steering wheel of his car, which was parked in Cindy's driveway. The autopsy later revealed that he had died from a heart attack, and indeed, he had a whole history of heart problems. But he had departed Cindy's place late in the evening after an evening of bridge with Cindy and the Woodcocks, and he was found the next morning by Cindy at 10:27 a.m. That would just be a really hard thing to process, on top of everything else. During April and into the spring, the creepy notes ramped up yet again. Cindy's burglar alarm sounded several times. Notes were found on her car by security guards patrolling the parking lot at work. Written in the dew on her windshield were the words, "Sleep well," which, fuck off. Ugh. The last time her alarm sounded was May 10th, 1989, and it would be a short 15 days later that Cindy James went missing, never to be seen alive again. A mere 5 days before she went missing, Cindy had written a letter to her sister Melanie. Melanie received the letter on May 26, 1989, which was the day after Cindy went missing. The letter stated, "This is just a wee note on this beautiful paper to say hi. I hope all is well with you and thanks for the interesting mail you've sent in the last while. I've been busy in the garden whenever I can, getting it slowly in shape. We've had some really nice weather lately. I'm still getting harassed from time to time by someone trying to break in here, but I think we've come up with a solution if it doesn't cost too much. Gord," she's referencing Gord Lalonde, who is the husband of one of Cindy's friends, "is going to wire in a sensor for me, so hopefully we'll know when someone enters the backyard and we can quietly call the police while he is busy doing his thing. I'm really hopeful we might actually catch him soon. Wouldn't that be wonderful? I could actually start living a normal life again. I've almost forgotten what that feels like. The police have been pretty useless, so it would be wonderful to hand him over on a silver platter. While I must bathe and get ready for Marion to pick me up. Hope to hear from you soon. Love, Cindy." So here's what happened in the hours leading up to Cindy's disappearance. After lunch on Thursday, May 25th, Marion Christensen called Cindy to chat about vacation plans and the like. Marion, as it turns out, would be going to Vancouver Island for a few days, which would change Cindy's plans for that afternoon. After this conversation, Cindy went out to get a makeover. She then went to Richmond General Hospital shortly before 4 p.m. to collect her paycheck. The checks technically couldn't be distributed until 4 o'clock exactly, so Cindy went out for coffee with a friend in the meantime. After receiving her pay, she went shopping for a birthday gift, and she also arranged for Tom and Agnes Woodcock to spend the night at her place playing bridge and to keep her company. Agnes and Tom arrived, as planned, at Cindy's place that evening. They honked their horn, expecting Cindy to peer through the curtains, but all remained still. They observed as well that her car wasn't in the driveway. They knocked on the front and back doors and even quizzed the tenant downstairs, but no one knew where Cindy was. As far as they knew, she had gone to the bank to deposit her pay. After that, it was anyone's guess. After waiting a few minutes, the Woodcocks decided to go home and call the police. While en route, they made a detour to Blundell Center, the location of Cindy's bank. There, her car sat lonely and unoccupied in the parking lot, a fair distance away from the bank itself. This fact alone raised alarm for the couple. Cindy had a consistent habit of always parking right next to the bank. She was so adamant about it that she would even wait for another car to pull out so she could park there if a spot wasn't readily available. The car was empty, but for some groceries sitting in the front seat. Alarmed, obviously, the Woodcocks rushed to the nearest police station approximately 1 kilometer from the bank. By this time, it was 11 o'clock p.m. It took a lot of convincing to get the police to visit the scene. The officers familiar with Cindy's case weren't on duty until morning, and the woman attending the counter insisted that they would need to wait 24 hours before filing a missing persons report. After 3 attempts and several minutes of waiting, an officer was sent to the parking lot to investigate. A drop of blood was observed on the driver's side door, and Cindy's bank card with a deposit slip were found under the car. The officer radioed for backup, and by 1 o'clock a.m., Constable Jerry Anderson arrived on the scene. The Woodcocks in the meantime went home, but Agnes was soon summoned to Cindy's house by police so they could access the interior, the Woodcocks being amongst the few people Cindy trusted with a spare key. At 2:30 a.m., Cindy's car was towed and locked up, ready for a more thorough investigation. 3:16 a.m. Officers went to the home of Roy Makepeace. Initially, Roy refused to open the door, but eventually they were permitted entry once a building manager confirmed their identities. Roy ordered the men to keep their distance. Littered about the penthouse was literature pertaining to sailing and firearms. Hanging on the walls were pictures of his ex-wife Cindy Makepeace, aka Cindy Hack, aka Cindy James. Ian Mulgrew, author of Who Killed Cindy James, states, Makepeace is obsessed with the woman who had left him 8 years previously. His apartment is a veritable shrine to his ex-wife. There are pictures of him hugging her while they pose on his yacht. Another snap catches her in profile. There's an 8x10 glossy of little Heidi, her lapdog, put down since Cindy died. Roy explained to the police that he, too, had been experiencing disturbing events, which bothered him enough that he now kept a rifle within arm's reach. He had tapes of some of the weird messages he had received, this being one of them. And if you couldn't tell, that said Cindy, dead meat, soon. The other, in the same voice, said, more smack, more downers, another grand after we waste the cunt. No more deal. Roy stated he had seen 2 people who seemed out of place sneaking around in front of his building. In regards to Cindy's disappearance, he had a confirmed alibi. He had cycled to a farmer's market with a friend, after which they picked up Roy's car and went out for dinner. Later, they went to his friend's home in Deep Cove, a 30-minute drive northeast of Vancouver, so that Roy could help her install a stereo system. He left the place around 11:30 p.m. and arrived home around midnight. So that ruled out Roy. No one had seen or heard anything suspicious, and although many retailers in the mall recognized Cindy's picture, they hadn't recalled seeing her the day of her disappearance. A thorough search of Cindy's car revealed, and this is a quote from Neil Hall, the car's heater had been on, it was noted, set to the defrost position. The transmission lever was in park, and Cindy's hospital parking pass was on the dashboard. The car ashtray was closed and contained 6 Cameo butts, Cindy's brand. The fuel tank was almost half full. The AM/FM cassette deck contained a Herb Alpert tape. Found between the front seats of the car were a number of Bank of Montreal quick deposit slips and envelopes. In the glove compartment, among maps and papers, was a pad of paper and the words KDV 784 small silver gray scrawled on it. Presumably, it was a note Cindy made of the license plate of a suspicious vehicle. The pad did not appear to have been used recently, since it was buried in the bottom of the glove compartment. The license number would be checked anyway. No BC car would be found matching the plate and description. Also in the glove box was a Sofrex handheld emergency alarm. Her black purse was on the front passenger seat between 2 brown paper Safeway bags with another 2 bags of groceries on the floor. The purse contained $2.77. On the back seat were 2 blue Sears bags containing a croquet set and some wrapping paper. The receipts showed the croquet set was bought at 12:33 p.m. and the wrapping paper at 12:43. There did not seem to be a single fingerprint or shred of solid evidence that would lead police to a suspect. One of the few clues was Cindy's deposit slip. It showed she deposited her paycheck at 7:58 p.m. Now, here's a strange little detail to throw into the mix. Cindy had a downstairs tenant named Richard Johnston, who had also sold her a $15,000 life insurance policy in the fall of 1988. Days after Cindy's disappearance, Johnston reported that someone phoned his office, an older-sounding man with a slight British accent, saying that he was Cindy's father. The caller was fishing for details regarding Cindy's life insurance policy. The receptionist recalled that such information was not to be disclosed over the phone and thus refused to say much, asking that he please visit the office in person. Autohack insisted that he never made that call, and as far as I know, no one ever visited the office in person. It was business as usual for Gordon Starchuk, June 8th, 1989. As part of a road crew, he, on occasion, had to get a little bit creative about where he went to relieve himself. He was working near a busy highway and glanced about to see where he might find some privacy. Not far from his work sat an old house, run down, vacant. He walked over, imagining it to be an ideal location to satisfy his simple need. It was in this place, among the weeds, the tall grasses, the overgrown foliage, that Cindy James was discovered, tied, strangled. The autopsy report later revealed that it was an overdose of morphine and flurazepam taken orally that had killed her. There was no hemorrhaging in the neck or blood vessels to indicate that she died from strangulation. Although puncture wounds were noted in her arm, no syringe was located in the area. Her body had been in the advanced stages of decomposition when found, a maggot colony infesting the needle wounds, her skin drying and cracking. Vasily Eufemstev lived in his van. He had decided that the abandoned house would be not at all a terrible place to park himself for a while. He had been living in that location for 3 weeks, within 5 meters of where the body was found. He even made use of a fire pit, which was located 2 meters from where the body was discovered. Yet he reported not having seen or smelled anything unusual. Had she been killed somewhere else and then left among the weeds to be found? Despite being tied, despite Vasily's account, law enforcement ruled her death to be a suicide, leading to the most expensive inquest in BC's history. The Ian Mulgrew book includes the notes that Constable Jerry Anderson, one of the attending investigators, took regarding Cindy's death, and he lists the reasons for believing that she committed suicide. And this is what he had to say. The scene where the body was found is about 1 mile from Blundell Center. It is a busy intersection and unlikely place to dump a body. It is more consistent with James walking there. James's coat was spread out on the ground with the outer side to the ground. Apparent care was used in placing it there in such a manner. No signs of struggle at the scene. Where there were cuts or tears in her blouse, there was no underlying injury. The body was not visible from the road, but it was in such a location that one would expect the body to be found reasonably quickly. Dr. Carlisle, pathologist, is of the opinion that James was alive at the scene. The body was in a comfortable position, even though the wrists and ankles were tied behind her back. Viewing the photographs best describes how she was positioned. She was not, quote-unquote, hog-tied, and there was no foreign debris such as grass and twigs on her front to suggest she was face down when she died. The ligatures were not tight around her wrists and ankles or her neck so as to indent the skin nor to cause any bruising. In fact, the ligature easily slipped off over one of the hands. It was felt the ligature on the other wrist and ankles could have been slipped off, but that was not tried because the tightness of the knots could not be affected. The knot examiner is of the opinion that the ligature that bound the wrists and ankles was consistent with being self-tied by the victim. He demonstrated how simple a task it was to tie himself up while in a seated position in the identical manner that James was tied. The autopsy found no signs of violence except the needle hole in the right arm. There was no bruising in the areas on the neck, wrist, or ankles to suggest that ligatures were violently applied. Dr. Carlisle believed the ligatures were not spontaneously applied. The preliminary results of the FLV toxicology section indicates that there was sufficient quantity of flurazepam, which police wrongly assumed for the first month of their investigation was a drug prescribed to James in her system to cause death. Further, that the stomach contained flurazepam, which indicates the drug was ingested. It would not seem reasonable for a person to ingest that quantity of drug involuntarily. Comment should be made about James's apparent good mood and display of positiveness. Dr. Friesen and other sources agree that often in cases of suicide, there is a tendency to become very happy and positive in that they have decided on a plan of action. Friesen said that he initially didn't feel James would commit suicide, but he wasn't provided with the police information about the ligatures or the toxicology. So these are all interesting points, and I just have so many questions. If she did this to herself at the scene, how did Vasily not discover her? A mere 6 feet from where he cooked his dinner, the smell would have been pungent. If there were no signs of struggle at the scene, would that not support the idea that she died elsewhere and was moved there? The pathologist believes she died there, but I'm curious how he came to that conclusion. Ozzy Caban, counter to Anderson's account, does not believe that Cindy could have done this to herself. Her family does not and has never believed it was suicide. The inquest was essentially a drawn-out war of experts contradicting experts, testimony contradicting testimony. It lasted for 40 days and over 3 months and cost $120,000, which would be about $210,000 now. It's estimated that the police department had spent about $1 million, which would equal about $1.7 million today, investigating Cindy's complaints. During the inquest, it was put forth that Cindy was possibly schizophrenic or suffering from dissociative identity disorder, then known as multiple personality disorder. I won't go into much detail about schizophrenia since we have chatted about that in previous episodes, but I'd just like to highlight that extremely elevated levels of anxiety can present in a similar way to schizophrenia at times. I'm not saying it's one way or the other, just saying as an FYI, that's a thing. The statements regarding Cindy's psychiatric health seem to only account for her presenting concerns after and as she had been suffering from this harassment for several years, which of course she's going to present as anxious and paranoid and afraid and mistrustful and secretive. Of course she fucking would. Of course she's despondent. I would be too. The theory that she had DID seems to have taken root for a lot of people, so let's chat about that for a bit. This is a very controversial diagnosis. Though in the 80s it was a little bit trendy, I guess you could say. People, psychiatrists included, were taken with this idea that a person could have several independent personalities within themselves. Roy Makepeace was of the opinion, and asserted this opinion during the inquest, that Cindy was suffering from DID. So what is it and what isn't it? The DSM-5 lists the diagnostic criteria as disruption of identity characterized by 2 or more distinct personality traits, which may be described in some cultures as an experience of possession. The disruption in identity involves marked discontinuity in sense of self and a sense of agency, accompanied by related alterations in affect, behavior, consciousness, memory, perception, cognition, and/or sensory motor functioning. These signs and symptoms may be observed by others or reported by the individual. Recurrent gaps in the recall of everyday events, important personal information, and/or traumatic events that are inconsistent with ordinary forgetting. The symptoms cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. The disturbance is not a normal part of a broadly accepted cultural or religious practice. The symptoms are not attributable to the psychological effects of a substance, example, blackouts or chaotic behavior during alcohol intoxication or other medical conditions, for example, complex partial seizures. Now, this disorder is extremely difficult to diagnose. First of all, not everyone in the field of psychiatry agrees that it even exists. So there's that. Like I said, it's highly controversial. I personally tend to believe that it does exist, and I'm certainly not going to invalidate the experiences of thousands of people who struggle with it on a daily basis. 1 to 3% of the world's population, in fact. I firmly believe in providing support for the client, whatever that may entail. Secondly, many of the clusters of symptoms can also be attributed to other disorders. The obvious diagnostic criteria, of course, being the presence of multiple personalities, but it's not always obvious in assessment or even in daily life. This order can get misdiagnosed as major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, PTSD, and a myriad of other psychotic disorders. The alternate personalities can be confused with psychotic hallucinations. So as you can see, it's complicated. This disorder is very much associated with extreme trauma in childhood. The emergence of another personality essentially acts as a protective mechanism for the child, a way to internally remove themselves from the trauma. Patients typically present with comorbid depression, anxiety, substance abuse, non-epileptic seizures, and flashbacks. Now, when it comes to dissociative identity disorder, we often think of pop culture examples. Split comes to mind. Jesus, this is turning into the M. Night Shyamalan episode. To be clear, DID is rare, but a person with DID exhibiting violence is even rarer. It's much more likely that an individual coping with DID will hurt themselves over someone else. Quick side note, I did watch Split, and yeah, I'm concerned about this idea of DID being a plot device representing the chaotic and the creepy. If you're looking for an interesting portrayal of DID in pop culture, I would recommend check out The United States of Terra. It's over the top, for sure, but it really makes an authentic effort to present the challenges faced with the disorder as opposed to something that should just invoke fear and stigma. Plus, they actually, consulted with people who have DID as well as professionals in that field. So anyway, back to Cindy. After the 40-day inquest, the jury was tasked with deciding what fate had met Cindy James. After some deliberation, they came back with what amounted to a resounding, "We just don't know." They couldn't decide if it was suicide, murder, or maybe even somehow an accident. They ruled her death to have been caused by an unknown event and did not recommend that the investigation be reopened. To this day, Cindy's family has insisted that her sister's tormentor was never brought to justice. So what say you, friends? Was Cindy the victim of a violent campaign of terror, or was she the victim of her own unidentified and untreated illness? If you have thoughts, questions, or concerns, you can find me on Facebook and Twitter at The Weird Pod, or you can write me via theweirdpod.com, and I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts. So, what's weird this week? First of all, Russia has decided to reopen the investigation into the Dyatlov past mystery, and I am fucking here for it. If you're unfamiliar with the case, check out episode 16 of the podcast, but also check out the episodes that the Astonishing Legends dudes did on it. I'm a little bit obsessed with the case, and I am dying to know what, if anything, this new investigation reveals. Secondly, a listing for a lovely suburban home in Philadelphia has found itself in a bit of a bind. The listing featured photos of a gorgeous brick exterior, lovely grounds, ensuite kitchen, and, oh yeah, a chic and, dare I say, stylish sex dungeon. The home, dubbed 50 Shades of Maple Glen by the realtor Melissa Leonard, has infuriated neighbors who I suppose believe that you shouldn't have fun during sex or that you shouldn't have sex for fun, whichever is most accurate. During a press interview, Leonard was confronted by an angry neighbor, and some real estate websites have even removed the photos, proving that we really need salt and pepper now more than ever. Well, that's a wrap on episode 18 of Weird, a podcast of curiosities. It would really mean a lot if you could pretty please, rate, subscribe, and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. It helps other weirdos find me, and it helps to diminish my persistent imposter syndrome. Stay warm out there, weirdos, and until next time, stay weird.